Hello and welcome to another lesson in AP Comparative Government. Today we're going to be talking about developing countries. Our key question for today is, what are the causes of poverty and health? The objectives for today are to describe the key characteristics of developing countries, to consider how imperialism and colonialism have affected developing countries, state, societal, and economic institutions. We're going to compare how post-imperial countries have suffered from ethnic and national division, limited economic growth, and weak states. We're going to evaluate and critique societal, economic, and political institutions and policies as pathway to development and democracy. And we're also going to be evaluating and critiquing the role of the international community in fostering and hindering change. This is the case for the IMF and the World Bank. The developing world is characterized into middle income and lower income countries. The first have undergone rapid development with a sharp tendency towards democratization and political and social stability. The latter have slid into a greater poverty, violence, and civil conflict. The World Bank defines lower income countries as those below 4,000 per capita for the GDP at purchasing power parity. So we're going to be looking at these numbers in terms of PPP, or purchasing power parity. Middle income countries, on the other hand, are those that are between $4,000 and $13,000 in terms of their PPP. The history of developing countries begins with the growing power of modern societies, which projected outward to conquer and incorporate new lands and peoples that could contribute to their rapid development. The result was the emergence of empires, single political authorities that have under their sovereignty a large number of external regions or territories, and different peoples. The term imperialism describes a system whereby a state extends its power to directly control territory, resources, and people beyond its borders. People often use imperialism interchangeably with colonialism, though both terms are different. Colonialism indicates the physical occupation of a foreign territory through military force, businesses, or settlers. Colonialism, then, is often the means for consolidating an empire. Here we see an image of the transitions of colonial powers within the history of the world. We're going to be looking at how those empires grow by incorporating different colonies within their rule. There's multiple political and social institutions of imperialism. The first that we're going to be looking at is the state as a form of political organization. This was imposed on much of the world outside of Europe. There's also going to be ethnic and national identities that were created where none existed before colonization, and gender roles from the imperial country are often imposed on the colonies. There is also multiple economic institutions that are going to be run by a system of mercantilism. I remind you that a system of mercantilism is one where you protect the resources and the power of the state. However, you engage with trade in tremendous amounts in order to gain more power and gain more resources. You're going to be exploiting the colonies, and you're going to be imposing really, really high tariffs on other states in order to control the trade system around you. The economic institutions of imperialism are therefore a transformation of the agricultural economies to suit the needs of imperial power. There's going to be economic organization under imperialism that impedes domestic development in the colonies. There's free trade suppression. Basically, there's no free trade whatsoever because colonies are forced to supply goods only to the imperial country, creating extractive economies in the colonies. The money that is produced in the colonies, the resources that are produced in the colonies, cannot go anywhere else except for the core country that is actually controlling them. So we're going to be seeing multiple challenges of post-colonialism. As colonies sought independence, a few challenges have arose in consolidating modern post-imperial states. Particularly, there has been difficulty in creating effective political institutions. Some of the first challenges are basically building state autonomy and capacity. So developing countries are going to have an absence of professional bureaucracy, following the departure of foreign imperial bureaucrats. They're going to have this lack of administrative power because they don't know how to rule themselves. Clientelism, rent-seeking, and corruption in the handling of the state jobs and revenue. There's also going to be sovereignty is going to be compromised by external actors, such as other states and international organizations, who are going to be looking to profit themselves instead of actually helping out the state at hand. Capacity refers to a state's ability to fulfill basic policy tasks, and autonomy refers to its ability to act independently of the public and foreign actors. Both are necessary to carry out policy, and both have been difficult for post-imperial countries to achieve. In terms of capacity, developing countries are frequently unable to perform many of the basic tasks expected by the public, such as creating infrastructure, providing education and healthcare, or delivering other public goods. This is due to the mercantilist practices of these countries and the legacy of clientelism left by empires. Autonomy has been equally problematic in this post-imperial world. On the surface, many of these countries appear to be highly autonomous, able to function without having to respond to public pressure. However, the state is not a highly independent actor, but is instead penetrated by groups that see it as a resource to be exploited rather than as a tool for achieving national policy. So this is basically an explanation of all these structures that do not necessarily work out in a given new state that is being transformed by the absence of imperialism. The result is of a weak capacity and autonomy is going to be high levels of corruption, and this perpetuates a system of core, periphery, and semi-periphery nations, as explained by Immanuel Wallerstein's modern world system theory. I'm going to go a little bit deep into this theory. When we talk about this modern world systems theory, we're going to be seeing core countries as the countries that have the power to run themselves. Basically, we're going to be seeing core countries as developed democracies, developed countries who are post-industrialized, who have the capacity to trade with other nations and be able to run that trade themselves. Periphery nations are those nations that are going to be dependent on the core countries. These are going to be post-colonial nations that have departed from colonialism and are now integrated into our modern economy. However, they depend fully on core nations in order to trade and survive in the global economy. There's also going to be semi-periphery nations who are going to be dependent on core countries, but are also going to have this relationship where other countries, other periphery countries, are going to be dependent on them. Mexico is an example of a semi-periphery nation because Mexico is basically dependent on the United States and Canada based on the the North American Free Trade Agreement. And a lot of Latin American countries also depend on the economy of Mexico to survive and to actually engage with the global market. An example of a periphery nation would be an island in the Caribbean who actually depends on both international actors and other states to survive in the world economy. A core nation here would be the United States or Canada, who is post-industrialized and fully developed. Many developing countries have struggled with the challenge of forging a single nation out of highly diverse societies. First, group divisions often have economic implications, just as they did under colonial rule. Some ethnic or religious group favored under colonialism continue to monopolize wealth in the post-independent society. Second, ethnic and religious divisions can similarly complicate politics. In countries where populations are heterogeneous, the battle for political power often falls along ethnic or religious lines as each group seeks to gain control over the state in order to serve its own particular ends. Economic and political difficulties that arise from such social divisions make the creation of a single national identity difficult and weaken the notion of citizenship. This notion of citizenship is defined as all individuals having a common political relationship to the state. This is a key concept here, so I'm going to repeat it. Citizenship is that all individuals have a common political relationship to the state. Finally, religiously, driven family structures and gender roles have permeated the contemporary societies of these countries. Again, we see that in Mexico, how the society of Mexico as a post-colonial country is solidified under Catholicism because that's what integrated into our society when we were a Spanish colony. So again, the challenges to build a unified nation state are going to be ethnic and religious divisions that are exacerbated by economic inequality and arbitrary political boundaries imposed by imperial powers. So just to remind you, it's going to be difficult to integrate a lot of different type of peoples into a given state. In case of economic growth, instead of undergoing economic modernization on their own terms, these countries experienced rapid changes directed by the imperial powers to serve their own needs. As a result, upon gaining independence, many of these countries found themselves in a continued state of economic dependency on their former empire and their more powerful neighbors. So this is the modern world system that I was talking to you about. This is what we call neocolonialism, the relationship and dependence between core and periphery countries. The former colonies need to break this cycle, resulted in two distinct mercantilist economies, and they were applied throughout the developing world. We're going to be looking at the two mercantilist economic policies in a second. So the first is known as import substitution. Under import substitutions, countries restrict imports, raise tariffs and non-tariff barriers. They do so to spur demand for local alternatives. To fill this demand, new businesses are built with state funds by creating subsidized or parastatal, partially state-owned industries. Import substitution is based on mercantilism. The state plays a strong role in the economy. Tariff barriers are used to protect domestic industries. Economic production is focused on industries that have a niche in the international market. They seek to integrate directly into the global economy, and so this policy has generally led to a higher level of economic development than import substitution. Several Asian countries eventually discarded import substitution in favor of export-oriented industrialization. So this is the other form of mercantilist economic policies. Countries that pursued an export-oriented strategy sought out technologies and developed industries that focused specifically on exports, capitalizing on what is known as the product life cycle. This policy is also based on mercantilism. The state plays a strong role in the economy. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers are used to restrict imports. The state actively promotes domestic production, sometimes creating state-owned businesses in developing industries. It is strongly criticized for creating hothouse economies with large industries relying on the state for support and unable to compete in the international market. Following import substitution, however, the state needed to devise a new economic policy. This transition is known as structural adjustment. The policy is based on liberalism. State involvement is reduced as the economy is opened up. Foreign investment is encouraged. Structural adjustment is often criticized as a tool of neocolonialism and for its failure in many cases to bring substantial economic development. So whenever those economic policies do not work, then most of the colonial powers are going to be changing with structural adjustment in order to actually adjust to a more liberalist economy. However, it doesn't necessarily work out for them. The states that really do well are the ones that are going to be focusing on an export-oriented market, as we see with China, who basically produces most of the toys in the world, produces a lot of technology in the world, and I mean the Made in China icon is very key to our society. By the 1980s, many developing countries, whether focused on import substitution or still largely focused on agricultural exports, as in Africa, faced deep economic problems, including high levels of government debt. Support from organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the IMF was conditioned on economic liberalization. So we're moving from mercantilist policies to policies of liberalization, which are often known as neoliberalist or neoliberalism or structural adjustment programs. We also know this as the Washington Consensus, since they reflect the policy preferences of institutions based in Washington, D.C., such as the World Bank again and the IMF. They typically require countries to privatize state run firms, end subsidies, reduce tariff barriers, shrink the size of the state, and welcome foreign investment. These reforms have been controversial and their benefits have been mixed. We will discuss the situation in greater detail shortly when we consider future direction from economic prosperity in poorer countries. The caveats of foreign aid, however, is that they might propagate the system of neocolonialism. Whenever we have the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank provide money to aid a country, there's a lot of different stipulations that you need to follow for that money. The economies of developing countries are unique. The strategies of import substitution and industrialization do not account for the majority of workers. These individuals often are part of what we know as the informal economy. The term informal sector refers to the segment of the economy that is not regulated, protected, or taxed by the state. Typically, the informal economy is dominated by self-employed or by small enterprises, such as an individual street vendor or a family that makes repairs for your home. Informal economies are often associated with weak states that are unable to effectively regulate the economy or prevent corruption. Under these conditions, the state might be highly bureaucratic, but unable to provide the oversight of property or markets that would be found where the rule of law is strong. Maid services, street vendors, bienes, and streetlight performers are common in the Mexico informal market. Arguably, the oldest job in the city is that of helping find a parking spot. These economic circumstances take us back to the fundamental question of where development exports should be focused, and can be clearly seen in the debate over one popular development tool, known as a microcredit or microfinance. Though these terms are often used interchangeably, there is a difference. Microcredit refers to a system where small loans, often less than $1,000, are made available to small-scale businesses that otherwise lack access to capital. Microfinance covers a much broader spectrum, including credits, savings, insurance, and financial transfers. Microcredit is often funded through nonprofit organizations, and in some cases the borrower is also held accountable to other borrowers in a local association, in that a failure of one individual to repay limits further loans that can be taken out by the members in that association. So it's a more based on your community, and you have to have the backup of your community in order to get a loan. The fusion of local institutions with those of imperial powers created challenges as these countries sought to chart their own independent courses. Weak states, conflict over ethnicity, nation, religion, and gender, and incomplete and distorted forms of industrialization all contributed to instability, authoritarianism, economic difficulties, and overall low levels of freedom and equality. Some countries have overcome many of these obstacles, but it is unclear whether their strategies and experiences provide lessons that can be easily applied elsewhere in the world. In this map, we therefore see the relationship between core, periphery, and semi-periphery nations. And so, the difference between the developed world and the developing world is very, very clear. We're going to see in blue the developed world. We're going to be seeing in yellow the developing world. And in orange, we're going to be seeing what is considered weak states. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. We thank Patrick O'Neill for his book, Essentials in Comparative Politics, and we hereby recognize the authors of all media content in this presentation.